Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Besnik Sinani, and together with Professor Ruggero Vimercati, we have organized this series of seminars dedicated to the study of prophetology in the Muslim tradition. Today's session, we're almost approaching the end of this seminar series, and we are particularly thrilled to have, even though virtually, to have Professor Marion Katz, whom I've had the privilege to have as my own teacher, or as I like to say, my own sheikha. And we are very, very happy that you're here. Although to many people who focus on the Islamic studies, there is no need for introduction, but in kind of respecting the tradition, I would like to say a few words, especially if there are those of you who are not familiar with the work of Professor Katz. So Professor Katz, she is professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, where she's been teaching since 2002. She studied at Yale University and later received her doctorate from the University of Chicago. Her research revolves around issues of Islamic law, ethics, gender, and ritual. Her publications include Body of Text, The Emergence of the Sunni Law of Ritual Purity, The Birth of the Prophet Muhammad, very pertinent to our presentation today. Later, she published Prayer in Islamic Thought and Practice and Women in the Mosque. Her most recent work, her recent book, Wives and Works, uses the issue of domestic labor to examine the relationship between pre-modern Islamic law, ethics, and social custom. Her presentation today is titled The Mawlid, or the commemoration of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, and the many ways of connecting to the Prophet Muhammad. We are absolutely thrilled that you have joined us and that you have joined this seminar series. Thank you very much, Professor Katz. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Sinani for the invitation and also for the very generous introduction. If at any point you can't hear me, please tell me. So thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this lovely series. Okay. So as Dr. Sinani mentioned, the commemoration of the Prophet's birthday was the focus of my attention some time ago when I published a book on the subject. More recently, I revisited this theme in the context of an edited volume on domestic devotions. Today, I'd like to revisit some of the themes I brought up in those places and engage with some newer themes that have been raised in the recent literature. I'd particularly like to note the contributions of Professor Ines Weinrich, whose excellent article, Reading Practices of the Arabic Mawlid, just came out in the 2022 volume In Praise of the Prophet, which she also edited and which is pictured on the slide here. In order to give some focus to a very broad subject, in this talk, I'll be looking particularly at ceremonies commemorating the Prophet's birthday in a specific period and region, Syria in the late 8th century AH or 15th centuries of the Common Era. We can get a nuts and bolts sense of what might have been involved in holding a mawlid in this period from a book from the genre of watha'il or shurul. These works provide fill-in-the-blank forms for common legal contracts and transactions, helping to ensure that they were formulated in ways that conform to the doctrines of the legal schools and thus would be enforceable in court. For the period I'm interested in here, the most important work is Jawahir al-Uqud, or Gems of Contracts, by Shamsuddin Muhammad al-Asyuti, who died sometime around 1475 of the Common Era. This compilation provides a model contract for a pious endowment, or waqf, to support the yearly performance of a Mawlid ceremony. As his name implies, al-Asyuti was Egyptian, but he did spend some time in Syria, and my sense is that given the circulation of religious personnel and ideas in the Mamluk period, and what we know about Mawlids, what he says on the subject is generally applicable to Syria as well. Because it's concerned with regulating the expenditures of an endowment, this model contract focuses on the material components of a Mawlid ceremony. It also provides some qualitative guidelines for the personnel and materials involved, which suggests some of the standards of excellence by which such a ceremony might have been judged. So let us first look at this passage in detail. According to Asyuti's model contract, the revenues of the property endowed to support the waqf should first be expended on the maintenance of the property. What is left over, the overseer, the nazir, should spend to pay, quote, a religious scholar, Rajul min Ahl al-Ilm Sharif, to sit in such and such a place on the preacher's chair, the kursi, and read to those people who are present with him the story of the birth, the Mawlid of our Master Muhammad, peace be upon him, on the 12th day of the month of Rabi' al-Awwal of every year. He should read in a way that is beautiful, hasana, precise, mutqana, elucidated, mufassara, and free from linguistic errors, in a voice that is audible to those who are present listening to it. And so the next item on the list of expenditures is that the overseer should arrange to pay a man of piety and integrity, Diana and the Arafat, to tend and suspend lamps and to place and light candles, and to spread a cloth and place food upon it before those who are attending the noble Mawlid. And he should spend such and such amount to pay a man to cook food and serve it. And he should use such and such amount to pay a good and righteous min ahl al-khair wa salah man who engages in the praise of the physical beauties, mahasin, personal attributes, sifat, miracles, mu'jizat, and moral virtues, akhlaq, of the messenger of God, peace be upon him. And he should spend so much to pay three groups implicitly of reciters, each group consisting of a head and three reciters, to perform a complete recitation of the Quran in that day and night, then perform a closing invocation and pray on behalf of the person who made the endowment, seek God's forgiveness for him and for all of the Muslims, male and female, and recite as many invocations, ad'iyah, as is convenient. Then the praise singer, a madh, or the praise reciter, should stand up and praise the messenger of God, peace be upon him, and sing or recite there as many of the beautiful poems in praise of the Prophet as is convenient. And he should finish by invoking blessings on the Prophet, peace be upon him. Then he should pray for the person who made the endowment and for all Muslims. The overseer should spend the remainder of the yield from the endowment on lamb meat, good quality bread, and other foodstuffs, and whatever may be needed of honey, sugar, rice, apples, quinces, fried foods, ghee, vegetables, herbs, in addition to the cost of oil, mats, candles, rose water, incense, firewood, and whatever else is needed. I think there are a number of things that we can learn from this model document. One thing that should be noted is that since this is a model for a legal document that would endow property in perpetuity to support annual performance of the Mawlid, it envisions a quite elaborate and resource-intensive version of the ritual. Many people presumably held Mawlids whose expenditures would not have required the endowment of property, and many Mawlids would not have involved the full range of personnel or materials described by al-Asyuti. However, this maximal enumeration of the components of a Mawlid does give us a sense of the repertoire that an average Mawlid might have drawn on. And excuse me while I go back a few slides. So one thing that immediately emerges is the variety of personnel that might be involved in performing a Mawlid. The first person enumerated is a member of the ulama class, someone whose qualification is his religious knowledge. I would like to mention in passing that while the model document uses the word rajul, or man, throughout, many Mawlids of this period were held by or for women and may well have involved female religious specialists. It's notable that this is the one officiant who's not described in the model contract with moral or religious qualifiers. Piety and virtue may be implied by membership in the ulama class, but the relevant credentials seem to be linguistic precision, clarity, and audibility. In contrast, the person of arranging the illumination and serving the food should simply be good and reliable. Finally, the person tasked with reciting or singing the praises of the Prophet is specified to be good and righteous. I think it's worth noticing that there's no indication that this person should be a scholar, right? So that suggests some of the sort of different angles that the people involved might be coming from. And if we look at the second paragraph here, also significant is the substantial list of foodstuffs and materials associated with the Mawlid. These include lamps and candles, their fuel, the personnel to light them, as well as a quite sumptuous list of provisions with clear emphasis on relatively luxurious foods and on sweets. Finally, the list includes aromatics, rosewater, and incense. The distinctiveness of these elements becomes clear when we compare this model document with the preceding one in the same book, which is for an endowment supporting Quranic recitation. In that model, there is much detail on the content and quality of the recitation, but nothing about food, illumination, or perfumes. Another notable difference is that the model endowment for Quranic recitation gives a space to fill in the name of the mosque where the recitation is to be performed, while that for performance of the Mawlid says nothing specific about a mosque or any specific kind of venue. As we shall see, the Mawlid in this period was quite literally a movable feast that could be held in many venues, including devotees' homes. So what might a Mawlid have looked like on the ground? A glimpse of an actual Mawlid ceremony is provided by the diary of Ahmed ibn Tawq, a modestly learned Damascene notary who recorded his daily activities for 2 decades starting in 1480. His entry for the 16th of Rabi' al-Awwal, 887 AH or 1482 CE recounts that on this date, I happened to go to the house of Shamsuddin Muhammad ibn Latfa, the confectioner, with the Sheikh Burhanuddin al-Naji. The Sheikh Shamsuddin Safaddin Nuruddin, the pious man from Ash-Shakur, a neighborhood in Damascus, and a group of confectioners and others were present, about 20 people in all. First, before the recitation, that is of the Mawlid, they served collections of sugar streets and pastries. After the Mawlid, they set out a meal, including a bean dish, couscous with chicken and meat, sweet rice with sugar and almond oil, and an apricot dish. After that, they served large amounts of sugar syrup and passed around musk and rosewater. As you can see, Ibn Tawq's description, although it's admittedly light on details about the textual content of the ceremony, lines up quite well with the guidelines set out by, in Jawahir al-Uqud. In addition to recitation of the story of the Prophet's birth in some unspecified form, the ceremony involves a quite luxurious meal, prominently featuring sweet foods. He also highlights the use of aromatic substances, musk and rosewater. I would suspect that he goes into this amount of detail in his diary specifically because this particular Mawlid was fancy. But again, there seems to be a fairly consistent checklist of items that could be included in an ideal or impressive Mawlid celebration. So when and why did people hold Mawlids in Syria in this period? Over the 20-year period covered by the surviving pages of his diary, Ibn Tawq mentions 41 Mawlid ceremonies. One may assume that this is not an exhaustive inventory, but probably reflects his fluctuating interest in attending or recording the celebrations. In terms of location, 9 of the 41 Mawlids are stated to have taken place in homes, 3 in mosques, 5 in Sufi lodges, 1 at a shrine, and 1 at the ruler's stable, which was at this time the site of some important governmental functions. In many cases, Ibn Tawq simply doesn't tell us where the Mawlid occurred. As is suggested by the model Waqf document, the most obvious occasion for a Mawlid was the Prophet's birthday, usually understood by Sunnis to have occurred on the 12th of the month of Rabi' al-Awwal, the 3rd month of the Islamic lunar calendar, but extending to the entire month of his birth. By the period under consideration here, however, Mawlid ceremonies were no longer exclusively associated with the day or month of the Prophet's nativity. Of the Mawlids referenced by Ibn Tawq, 18 occur in the month of the Prophet's birthday, and the other 23 at other times of the year. Whereas Mawlids held in the month of the Prophet's birth often seem to have been occasioned by the anniversary itself, ones held at other times of year were often occasioned by life cycle events. Of the 23 Mawlids Ibn Tawq mentions attending in months other than Rabi' al-Awwal, 9 are explicitly stated to have been performed in observance of special occasions in the lives of the hosting families. 2 aqiqas, a sacrifice performed for a newborn infant, 1 engagement, 4 weddings, 1 funeral, and 1 gala arrival in town by the ruler's wife. The performance of Mawlids in conjunction with life cycle celebrations is also recorded by other sources for Damascus in this period. The historian Ibn Tulun refers to a Mawlid that was recited at the conclusion of a contract of marriage, another at the joint wedding of 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and a third held by the governor of Damascus in honor of the circumcision of 2 of his sons. Mawlids associated with life cycle events generally seem to have been held in family homes, and in addition to the pious motivations involved, it seems that a Mawlid may have been a religiously meaningful way to hold a party. I've talked in other venues about the logic of performing Mawlids in honor of life cycle events and the ways in which the performance of Mawlids may have served to consecrate domestic space. So since this series is focused on prophetology, today I'd like to focus specifically on the ways in which Mawlids in this time and region helped believers to strengthen their bonds with the Prophet Muhammad. To do so, I'd like to use the rubrics of emotion, reciprocity, the senses, prophetic presence, and knowledge. Because these modes of connection with the Prophet were subject to some degree of diversity of opinion, in the course of this survey, I'd also like to look at the range of ways in which different contributors to the tradition approached the theme in question. So to illustrate the diverse ways in which Mawlid ceremonies forged connections between their participants and the Prophet, I'd like to look specifically at 2 examples of Mawlid texts produced in this general time and place. The first of these is a work entitled Durar al-Bihar fi Mawlid al-Mukhtar, Pearls of the Oceans at the Birth of the Chosen One, by Ahmed ibn Abdurrahman ibn Makkiyah, who died in 907 AH or 1502 CE. This Mawlid, which survives in an autograph copy, is dated 786 or 1471. Ibn Makkiyah was from Nablus, and although he eventually moved to Damascus, he wrote this Mawlid before he did so. Ibn Makkiyah is identified as a preacher, rather than primarily as a scholar. Like most Mawlid texts, his was probably more a compilation of existing components than an original composition. His contemporary, the historian Ibn Tulun, describes another preacher as having collected a good Mawlid, Jama'a Mawlidan Hasanan, and this is probably how we should imagine Ibn Makkiyah's contribution as well. Mawlid texts were traditionally composites, interspersing narratives of the Prophet's prehistory and birth with interludes of devotional poetry and invocation of blessing on the Prophet, and Durar al-Bihar follows this format. The most distinctive component of a Mawlid text is often its opening passage, known as the Dibaja, which is traditionally an extended praise of God, alhamdulillah, in elaborate rhymed prose, incorporating motifs related to the Prophet's birth. In this case, the Dibaja is a version of the opening passage associated with the historically widespread Mawlid known as Mawlid al-Aruz. I think we should assume that Ibn Makkiyah used an existing Dibaja, or rhymed prose opening, as the opening of his own selection from the repertory of narrative and poetic materials available for the Mawlid. This Mawlid text is of a length appropriate for verbatim presentation in a single sitting, and its alternation of narrative and poetry make it ripe for performance. As Ines Weinreich has discussed in depth, it's difficult to recover the intended musical dimension of Mawlid texts, but it seems likely that the verses were intended to be sung. One can easily imagine Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid being used in a format similar to the one suggested by the model Waqf document described above. Its content also tracks remarkably well with the description in the model document. Following the narrative portions focusing on the Prophet's prehistory, birth, and nursing, it has sections covering his miracles, mu'jizat, and his beautiful physical and moral attributes, mahasin wa sifat, and those are all words used in the model document for sort of the standard components of a Mawlid. So the other Mawlid I'd like to use, and it's arguable, I think it's really debatable whether this is a text about the Mawlid or a text to be used in Mawlid sessions or ceremonies. It was composed by a person mentioned in Ibn Tawq's anecdote cited above. In other words, this is the guy who went to that Mawlid with him. The scholar Burhanuddin al-Naji, who died in 900 AH or 1495 CE. Indeed, one of the surviving manuscripts of this Mawlid was copied by Ibn Tawq himself, in his home near the Qasab Mosque in the year 905 or 1500. So, I mean, this is from a pretty tight circle. And Naji is best known as a Hadith scholar, although he also engaged in preaching or wa'az. And Naji's Mawlid text, which survives in manuscript, the image shown here is from a manuscript, is a lengthy source book of learned disquisitions on matters associated with the Mawlid, from which, he explains, a reciter can select at will for the needs of a specific occasion. He regarded the celebration of the Mawlid overall as a religiously legitimate innovation, a bid'ah hasana, but laments the quote-unquote catastrophic innovations that have been introduced into the Mawlid ceremony. His ambivalent attitude toward the Mawlid tradition at large is suggested by the fact that he appends to his own work the closing poem from the Mawlid of Shamsuddin ibn al-Jazari, best known for his work on the different readings of the Quran, which Naji praises highly, but from which he states, quote, "I have deleted verses referring to the mother of our prophet, peace be upon him, who died in the age of ignorance, for fear that people would invoke God's satisfaction upon her." In other words, he's worried that people are going to say radiyallahu anha when she's mentioned, so he is, sort of censored the poem to discourage that. Unlike Ibn Makkiyah's, Naji's work is explicitly intended to be informative. He states in his introduction that he has only briefly alluded to stories that are well known in order to focus on matters that are not conveniently available in other sources. His work is deeply concerned with issues of religious orthodoxy and factual correctness. Unlike Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid, it also focuses on issues of scholarly disagreement. He describes it as a resource in cases of dispute, يعتمد عند التنازع عليه, and notes that he has been at pains to set the record straight on issues where, quote, most people of the time are following the wrong opinion. So to our themes. The first means of connection with the prophet that I'd like to mention is emotion. One of the most obvious ways in which Mawlid texts help to cultivate connection with the Prophet Muhammad is by evoking religiously meritorious emotions. As I've discussed in detail elsewhere, Mawlid celebrations were explicitly premised on the idea that loving the Prophet and rejoicing in his bestowal on humanity by God were emotions commanded by Quran and Hadith. Mawlid celebrations were designed both to evoke and to express these religiously meritorious emotions. Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid includes two narratives explicitly expressing this justification for the Mawlid celebration that had become almost canonical for the Mawlid genre by his day. One is an anecdote about the Prophet's uncle Abu Lahab, father of fire, known to all believers for having been consigned to the flames of hell in chapter 111 of the Quran, Surah Al-Masad. In this narrative, which embellishes the report in the Sahih al-Bukhari, Abu Lahab frees a slave woman who brings him the glad tidings of the birth of the Prophet. God alleviates his punishment in hell every Monday night in recognition of this deed. Ibn Makkiyah paraphrases the comment of Ibn al-Jazari, who declared, "If Abu Lahab, the unbeliever whose condemnation was revealed in the Quran, was rewarded in hell for his joy on the night of the Prophet's birth, what is the case of a Muslim monotheist of the community of Muhammad the Prophet, who delights in his birth and spends all he can afford for love of him? By my life, his reward from the beneficent God can only be that he graciously causes him to enter the gardens of bliss." Ibn Makkiyah follows this anecdote with a story of which is also canonical in the Mawlid genre, with a story of a Jewish man and wife who observe their Muslim neighbor celebrating the Mawlid. The wife has a dream in which she sees the Prophet Muhammad visiting the Muslim neighbor's home. She asks one of his companions who this august figure is. The companion replies, "He is the messenger of God who has entered this home to greet and visit its inhabitants because they have rejoiced in his birth, and their delight has increased." Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid also uses the voices and situations of figures in the Mawlid narrative to evoke emotions of longing for the Prophet. When the Bedouin woman Halima comes to take the infant Prophet for wet nursing, Durar al-Bihar presents a poem expressing the inner sentiments, the lisan hal, of the Prophet's mother, Amina, beginning, Allow me to weep and repine over the beloved ones, for in the heart there is a burning from the fire of separation. When it is time for Halima to, in her turn, to part from the Prophet, there's an equally lengthy and emotive poem evoking her feelings of longing. As is discussed in several contributions in the volume In Praise of the Prophet that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, longing for the Prophet and longing to visit him at his grave in Medina is a central theme of devotional poetry in this period. So there's no doubt that this is an emotion that's not sort of something that participants are to imagine being experienced by Amina and by Halima. It's an emotion they're supposed to be participating in themselves. If longing for the Prophet was a standard religious sentiment, Durar al-Bihar also evokes emotions that were potentially more controversial. For instance, in more than one place, the text emphasizes the pathos of the Prophet's orphanhood. Noting that the Prophet's father likely died during his mother's pregnancy, it declares that this is the utmost and highest degree of orphanhood. You can see it in this passage on the screen. It follows with 2 lines of poetry ending, "My life is ransom for the one who is unique in his orphanhood. For indeed, the most beautiful of pearls is the one that is without peer." And this is a play of words, since a peerless pearl is known as yatim, the same word used for a child that's lost his father. A later line of poetry describes the Prophet as, quote, saying, "This is a poor orphan adorned by nobility, for whose sake orphans and the poor are honored." In a similar vein, if more briefly, the text describes how the Prophet experienced sorrow and care, huzn wa gham, at the death of his mother. As I've discussed elsewhere, Muslim scholars sometimes reflected on the proper nature and scope of the emotions that Mawlid narratives could legitimately evoke towards the Prophet. More than a century before Ibn Makiyah wrote his Mawlid, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is said to have responded to a question about, quote, what some preachers do in Mawlids in their crowded gatherings, which include the elite commenters, men and women. The questioner was concerned that these include, quote, mentioning the Prophet in a way that detracts from perfect reverence from him, to the point that those who hear it display sorrow and tenderness, and the Prophet enters the realm of those who are pitied rather than held in awe. Well, Burhan ad-Din al-Naji, in the work that under consideration here, doesn't specifically discuss the Prophet's orphanhood or the proper response to it, an omission that I would argue may be meaningful in itself. And Naji's attitude towards this issue is suggested by a section of his work in which he emphasizes that veneration or respect, ta'azim, of the Prophet is distinct from and religiously superior to love for him. So our second theme, reciprocity. As I've argued at length elsewhere, Mawlid ceremonies can in part be understood as mechanisms for the generation of religious merit, or thawab, through meritorious actions, including Quranic recitation, the invocation of blessings on the Prophet, and the pious expenditure and rejoicing involved in holding the Mawlid overall. This merit not only served to enhance the participants' prospects in the afterlife, but was envisioned as being donated to a variety of recipients, thus reinforcing a variety of relationships. The viability and limits of the transfer of merit was an issue subject to some religious debate, but donation of merit seems to have been a widespread element of Mawlid ceremonies in many times and places. Tracing its history is difficult because its location is usually the Mawlid's closing invocation, and as Ines Weinreich has observed, quote, the concluding dua is not necessarily conceived as part of the Mawlid text. It's included in many, but not all, manuscripts and prints. However, in some cases, it appears to have been added later, for instance, in different handwriting. It's thus often difficult to determine whether the closing invocations referencing the donation of merit are an integral part of a given Mawlid text, and thus how to date them. But common recipients include the host of the Mawlid, the gathered participants, the participants' parents and other deceased kin, and the Muslim community at large. For the purposes of this talk, the most significant recipient mentioned in such invocations is the Prophet Muhammad himself. For instance, the closing dua of an undated Mawlid preserved in Damascus requests, quote, a bounteous reward and a blessed recompense, thawaban jazilan wa ajran mubarakan, for the recitation that has just occurred, and prays that it be transferred fully and in its entirety to the Prophet Muhammad and to a long list of other recipients, beginning with Adam and Eve and ending with, quote, those by reason of whom and for whose intentions we have recited this noble Mawlid. Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid does not have a closing prayer of this kind, although a dua might well have been added by the reciter in the context of actual performance. However, Burhanuddin an-Naji discusses the issue of donation of merit to the Prophet at length, suggesting that the practice was both common and disputed. The practice cannot have been genuinely new, since it was discussed by scholars of previous centuries, including Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. However, its prevalence and its incorporation into Mawlids may have been relatively recent. And Naji cites his own teacher, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, as having been questioned about the practice of saying, O Lord, make the merit of what I have recited an increase in the honor of our master, the messenger of God, peace be upon him. Ibn Hajar responds, this is an invention of the latter-day reciters. I know of no precedent for their doing it. Perhaps unsurprisingly, an-Naji disapproves of this practice. The reasoning he cites is threefold. First, donation of merit to the Prophet is an innovation, bid'ah, without foundation in the Sunnah. Second, for an inferior to bestow a gift on a superior is presumptuous unless explicitly authorized by the superior. Here again, an-Naji prioritizes the awe and respect one should have for the Prophet over the feelings of intimacy implied by many Mawlid texts. Finally, the donation of merit to the Prophet is seen as superfluous in an-Naji's formulation, tahsil al-hasil, because the Prophet is in any case rewarded by God for the good actions of all of his followers. For those who did believe in it and practice it, donation of the merit of Mawlid recitations to the Prophet must have been a means of reinforcing a relationship of love and support with the Prophet. In recent years, scholars such as Christian Lange and Adam Bursey have drawn our attention to the role played by the senses in various forms of Muslim piety historically, and the senses certainly played a central role in Mawlid celebrations. Durar al-Bihar invokes a multisensory environment in which motifs in the text reference both the physical presence of the Prophet Muhammad and the physical experience of participation in the Mawlid. One of the most pervasive motifs in the text is that of light. The theme of light is established in this Mawlid in the opening block of rhymed prose, which, like other renditions of the tradition properly known as Mawlid al-Arus, begins, praise be to God, who brought forth from the blaze on the forehead of the bride of the presence a luminous dawn, and made rise in the orbits of perfection from the constellations of beauty a radiant sun and moon, and chose the master of the two worlds as a beloved, a confidant, and an emissary in pre-eternity. Like most other Mawlid texts, Durar al-Bihar focuses on the belief that the pre-existent light of Muhammad was brought forth at the dawn of creation and traveled through the loins of his ancestors until the birth of the earthly prophet, who emerges as a radiant being who literally illuminates all that is around him. In this context, we may hearken back to the model contract we looked at the beginning of the paper and its enumeration of the elements necessary for a Mawlid, which prominently features the lighting of candles and the suspension of lamps in the space where the Mawlid is performed. We cannot know how often Mawlid hosts were able to fulfill this sumptuous vision, but it's suggestive that the diarist Ibn Tawq mentions bringing a large gilded candle as his contribution to a Mawlid held by one of his neighbors in 1483 CE. Given that lavish artificial illumination must have been a quite rare and extravagant experience in the world of the late 15th century, we can imagine that it was a distinctive sensory impression that evoked the wonder of the Prophet's luminous presence for the participants in the Mawlid. Another pervasive theme in Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid is the Prophet's sweet scent, which is referenced more times than can be enumerated here, and I think the same is true of light. Over and over, the text references the idea that at his birth, quote, the universe was perfumed with the scent of musk and ambergris. As noted by Anya Kang in her relatively recent book, Scent from the Garden of Paradise, there are numerous Hadith texts associating the Prophet with the smell of musk. There's also a Hadith transmitted by An-Nasa'i in which Aisha declares that he perfumed himself with musk and ambergris, exactly the scents referenced most often in Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid. In this context, we should remember Ibn Talq's remark that musk was passed around at the Mawlid he described attending in 1482. Here again, the thematic motifs of the Mawlid text and the sensory environment of the Mawlid ceremony would have powerfully evoked sensations associated with the actual presence of the Prophet as described by those who knew him. Although the scent of roses is not thematized in the same way in Ibn Makkiyah's Mawlid, the other perfume that's associated with Mawlids in the model contract and by Ibn Talq is rosewater. As was already discussed by Anna Marie Schimmel long ago, the Prophet is widely believed to have emitted the scent of roses. Schimmel quotes Rumi, among others, as expressing the idea that, in her words, the believer can still experience the Prophet's scent from the fragrance of the rose. Given the deep links between olfaction, memory, and emotion, the use of these scents could have been powerful means to evoke the Prophet for Mawlid participants. Another element of the sensory environment of the Mawlid was melody. In her recent chapter, Reading the Practices of the Arabic Mawlid, in the volume In Praise of the Prophet, Ines Weinreich explores what it is possible to know about the sound and aesthetics of Mawlid recitation. She emphasizes the limits on what it's possible to reconstruct, noting that while, quote, it is in some cases plausible that qira'ah, recitation, exceeded the normal speech voice, we have at this state of research no information on how a Mawlid text was recited before the late 19th century. She also notes that the poetry incorporated into Mawlid texts is in forms traditionally associated with song, and concludes that, quote, it is therefore not too far-fetched to imagine that such forms, when included into Mawlid texts, were sung as well. As she and I have both observed, the professionals who perform devotional poetry within and beyond the context of Mawlids, known as munshidun, were known for their knowledge of melody and the quality of their voices. Writing in the first half of the 10th century Islamic century, or the 16th century CE, Ibn Tulun notes the performance of a Mawlid recited by Muhammad al-Ju'aydi, whom he identifies as a muezzin, and who is described in another source as, quote, the head of the Mawlid reciters in Damascus, Ra'is al-Mawlid b'Dimashq, and a master of the science of melody, al-Naghma. He also describes a head muezzin of the Umayyad Mosque, who died in 1480, as the possessor of a proverbially lovely voice and as a reciter of Mawlids. Ibn Tulun writes of another munshid, an Egyptian who moved to Damascus and died in 1530, quote, he was a master of the discipline of music, kana ustadhan fi ilm al-naghma. He continued for more than 30 years reciting Mawlids and performing at weddings. In every context, he would recite/sing yunshid, the poetry that was appropriate to it, and the more he recited/sang, the more beautiful his voice became. I'm using the slash because of the vocal performance was. It's possible that the degree of focus on the melodic and aesthetic qualities of Mawlid recitation varied with the talents and values of the individuals involved. Weinreich notes that, quote, I could not find any praise from Sheikh Burhanuddin al-Naji's voice or musical competence, which would seem to fit the format of his Mawlid text, if indeed it is a repertoire for Mawlid ceremonies rather than a work about the Mawlid. It's a work that de-emphasizes rhymed prose and poetry in favor of sober recital of information about the Prophet. However, Weinreich also notes that an-Naji's associate and successor, Barakat ibn al-Tayyab, was praised precisely for the beauty of his voice and for his musical acumen. Nevertheless, a surviving work by Ibn al-Khayyal inveighs against the reciters at gatherings and funerals who chant the Quran with, quote, the tunes of sinners, which he describes as melodies borrowed from music, al-angham al-musta'ara min al-musiqa. It would seem that Ibn al-Khayyal had musical expertise, but believed that Quranic recitation was not an appropriate arena for it. It would be interesting to know how such attitudes applied to the different aspects of Mawlid performance. Regardless, there's good evidence that vocal beauty, however understood, was often a valued component of the sensory experience of Mawlid participation. Finally, the Mawlid celebrations of 15th century Damascus involved food, and finally, in terms of the sensory experience, and particularly sweets. It's certainly true that no taste directly indexed the prophet in the same way that the sight of brilliant illumination or the scent of musk or roses may have done. However, in addition to playing a role within the system of pious and social exchange of which Mawlids were a part, the relatively sumptuous food may have had other significance. Throughout the narratives traditionally recounted about the prophet's birth, and particularly in the narratives involving the wet nurse Halima, the prophet's barakah is associated with nourishment and well-being. Halima and her cohort are depicted seeking nurslings in a time of drought and hunger, and her contact with the infant prophet is associated with fertility and abundance of food for both animals and humans. In this context, the lavishness of the refreshments may have represented more than an indulgence. In addition, in his study of Ibn Tawq's diary, Torsten Volina has shown that sweets played a quite distinctive role in religious celebrations in this time and place. In a world where cheap sweeteners produced by an industrialized food system are omnipresent, it's easy to forget that sweetness would have been a relatively rare and prized flavor in pre-modern diets. Volina notes that based on the diary, even the more prosperous members of Ibn Tawq's social circle seem to have reserved sweets for special occasions. More specifically, he argues that candy and pastries were primarily reserved for religious holidays, while sweet drinks were associated with life cycle events. In particular, the prophet's birthday was less a holiday than a whole festive month, with special foods and sweets served at gatherings throughout. I'm not arguing that all of these associations were explicit, but that all of these components of the Mawlid would have combined to create a multisensory experience with meaningful religious resonance. The ideal Mawlid created an experience where a devotee could affirm, in the words of one of the poems included in his Mawlid by Ibn Nakiyah, that, quote, his remembrance is pleasant in my ear and in my mouth. Finally, it's quite possible that for many people envision the prophet as being literally, although not physically, present in the Mawlid ceremony. The prophet was understood as being alive and sentient, although the scope of his spiritual presence and awareness could be debated. For instance, in what sense a believer's words could reach him when not present at his grave in Medina. The Mawlid ceremony often culminated in the participants standing up, al-qiyam, in honor of the prophet at the point where his birth was narrated. The date and prevalence of this practice is difficult to gauge since it's not always explicit in Mawlid texts. While Vimercati points out that some Mawlid manuscripts have stage directions indicating that qiyam, many more do not. Certainly by the period in question here, the qiyam was well established. By the first half of the 16th century, Ibrahim al-Halabi felt the need to write a separate essay in support of his own disapproval of the custom, writing that, quote, many of the people of our time believed that it's obligatory to stand up at the mention of the birth of the prophet, to the point that a learned person has taken offense at this poor one's omitting to do so. And Naji, too, firmly rejected it, writing that, quote, standing up at the mention of his birth is innovative, muhdath, and does not constitute a legitimate expression of love for the prophet. Despite the apparent prevalence of this practice, though, it does not seem to have been widely theorized beyond the general claim that it expressed the devotee's love and veneration for the prophet. It thus remains unknown, or at least unknown to me, to what extent the average participant might have understood the Mawlid as an experience of the spiritual presence of the prophet. Knowledge. So despite the divergence of Naji's Mawlid text from the more widespread model represented by Ibn Nakiyah's work, there's no clear dichotomy between the kinds of devotional connection to the prophet fostered by Ibn Nakiyah and the more informative approach of Naji. I would argue that it's not until modernity that you get a sort of purely informative approach represented. Rather, Ibn Nakiyah as well, in part, seeks to inform Mawlid participants about the prophet's life and qualities, and Naji notes towards the end of his work that, quote, its main objective is to seek blessings, a tabarruk, from the mention of the prophet. He closes his work by stating that It has drawn blessing from his mention and perfumed itself with his perfume. In providing information about the Prophet, Burhanuddin Naji is not merely transferring data, but offering a means of sanctity and salvation. Knowledge, too, should be seen centrally as a means of connecting oneself with the Prophet. In short, despite their apparent simplicity and their relative lack of explicit doctrinal content, I believe that Mawlid celebrations and the texts that were written that were associated with them are rich sources for the many ways in which some Muslims historically have striven to generate connections between themselves and the Prophet Muhammad. One of the reasons that its logic may be elusive is that it was centrally shaped by Munshidun, a group whose views and values are much less known to us than those of the ulama class, with whom they only partially overlap. The practice of the Munshidun presumably also responded to the beliefs and preferences of ordinary people, which are even less accessible to us. All the more reason, then, to ask what Mawlids have to teach us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Katz. Was a rich presentation, indeed. One of the things that came to mind I'm trying to follow the camera. One of the things that came to mind as you were giving your presentation is this link between the idea of the sensory and the presence, because at least in every single Mawlid that I have attended in the Hijaz, one particular moment where there was this kind of emphasis in kind of burning scent and someone walking around in spreading oil, perfumed oils. It was particularly that moment when there is the recitation or the expectation of the Prophet, of the presence of the Prophet, marhaban ya nur al-ayn marhaban. So there is a particular kind of concentration, so to speak, or gravity at that moment. So I'd like to invite everyone to kind of prepare their questions, and I was wondering if I can take advantage and kind of throw my first question there while others are preparing for their own. And I'd like to kind of perhaps stop for a moment at this conception of connectivity, or the sila, which is something that both Ruggero and I have been discussing here quite a bit. And kind of religiously speaking, or kind of in the theological, in the larger scheme, what is the significance of why is kind of this connectivity or this sila with the Prophet kind of chased and nurtured and sought after? How does it link with perhaps conceptions of salvation and soteriology? And so in a way, what kind of light does that shed on the Muslim conception of the Prophet himself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I feel as if, you essentially just said it. In other words, that the whole idea is that connection to the Prophet is salvific, right? And, so often in Mawlid texts, this idea of intercession is centered, right? And, that's definitely true of the texts of dua for the end of Mawlids that I'm familiar with. At the same time, I would say, even though I think that that's the sort of the correct overall theological framing for that, I would say that one thing about Mawlids that makes them both sort of rich and, sort of, I don't know, frustrating or ambiguous or something as sources is that they really are sort of under theorized. I mean, I guess that's wrong because it's sort of judging them by a criterion that they might not accept. But I mean, Mawlid texts, the way that I ended up writing a whole book about them is that Mawlid texts don't have that much, Burhanuddin Naji is a little weird in the sense that he's sort of here are my issues about the Mawlid, right? And he centers doctrine, he centers argumentation, and he's coming right out and telling you exactly what he thinks in doctrinal terms, right? And that's weird, but I don't think that it's not weird. I mean, it's fine. You can see why he's doing it. He was an important person. It's a very fascinating text. but at the same time, I don't think we can, because he is so sort of explicitly uncomfortable with and engaged in critique of forms of piety, like elements that are quite sort of ubiquitous in the sort of broader Mawlid tradition, as I'm familiar with it. I don't think we can see him as just sort of like articulating the same things that other people who wrote or performed or attended Mawlids were tacitly thinking, And so like part of it is that we don't necessarily have access to what they're thinking. And part of it is, I think, that that's just not the kind of practice that it is, right? I too, like I went to a lot of Mawlids in Yemen, and women's Mawlids, and yeah, like at the Qiyam, at sort of the moment of the birth, they would carry around incense, and you would sort of get censed, and there would always be a shaker full of rose water, and you'd get doused vigorously with rose water. So you always came out of these things smelling fantastic, but it definitely turned this moment of the Prophet's birth into this very multi-sensory experience. And I don't want to, like imply that like, oh, there must be huge continuity, but I think there are, as I tried to suggest, some indicators, some forms of evidence that like these are not new things. And I don't think that the average performer or participant necessarily had a sort of well-articulated idea of like, well, this is why we do this, and this is what it means doctrinally, and this is what rosewater means to me. I feel as if it was sort of a more practice-oriented tradition.
So I'll definitely have a few other questions to throw in there. But perhaps you want to go ahead, and then if there's time.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. First of all, my first question goes a little bit in the direction of Besnik's question, actually, because as he said, we were discussing a little bit about this notion of connection and whether and in what sense it can be useful to describe a sort of relationship of Muslims with their prophet, because connection is a certain type of relationship. I mean, connection means that both parts are linked. I mean, if one part moves, the other moves with it somehow. I mean, connection is not just relationship. And this refers, I mean, in our reflection also a little bit to William Graham's notion of Isnad paradigm, that this idea of connectivity, which according to his understanding is characteristic for Islamic traditionalism. I mean, he calls it Islamic traditionalism. So I was asking then in a second sense the question, I mean, there are various ways of connecting, let's say, or linking to the prophet, and then of course we will have to discuss, is this really a connection, or is it just a form of evoking, of presence? Can you call this connection? I mean, what is the difference? I mean, this is, I think, an interesting question. But then the Mawlid, I mean, in difference with other forms of evoking the presence of the prophet, like, I mean, you mentioned the tasliya, praying for the prophet. I mean, you have the burda, you have the transmission and recitation of hadith, you have in many ways, and you have the Mawlid, which somehow integrates all these many ways in a very central way as well, as you explained so well. And there is this aspect of celebration in Mawlid, I think, which is distinguished maybe the Mawlid from other forms of evocation of the prophetic presence. I mean, there's really a sense, I think, of this community experience of celebration, of ceremonies, as you described it. So I was asking myself, what type of connection is this somehow? I mean, why is there for for remembering the birth, why is there this, you know, aspect of celebration? Okay, what does it mean actually? You know, celebrating the birth. I mean, of the Prophet. Okay, and so just one question which came up to me, because maybe it's a very specific type, you know, of working the prophetic presence, which is not like other types.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I have to say that, you know, the word connection, you know, like I may not have thought it through as deeply as you have. I would say that, you know, sort of, I would stick by it to the extent that I feel as if, you know, in the context of the Mawlid ceremony or the Mawlid genre, you know, these texts, that there really is the idea of sort of contributing to the construction of an ongoing bilateral relationship, right? And I think that that's a little more than, you know, just saying, well, this is to experience the Prophet or something. The volume that I can't recommend too much, In Praise of the Prophet, which, like, honestly, had I already read it when you invited me, I might have said you should invite Ines Heinrich instead. But you know, I think there they deal a lot with sort of devotional poetry about the Prophet. Only this one chapter is really about Mawlids. But I mean, authors in that volume keep on sort of recurring to like referencing Suzanne Stetkiewicz's model, right? Of, you know, the Burda poems as sort of like, you know, like adopting this model of panegyric where, you know, sort of like it's a tribute to the, you know, sort of to the potentate that you were hoping will patronize you, right? And I do think that that is a useful model. I mean, you know, like you don't have to get it directly from this analysis of the poetry, but, you know, what I found when I was working on Mawlids for the book was that I do think it's really all part of sort of a larger, you know, sort of, I feel that when Burhanuddin and Naji says, well, you know, like the problem with this, you know, you can't donate your merit to the Prophet in part because it's just presumptuous and wrong to like preemptively make an offering to a superior, right? That's like, he's really cutting, you know, like he's actually identifying and rejecting, you know, like the logic that is more prevalent, which is like initiating, you know, like it's the first move where, whether it's donation of merit or whether it's, you know, rejoicing or evoking love, that it's all about the idea that since the Prophet is sort of infinitely gracious, that your overtures to the Prophet are inevitably going to result in some kind of reciprocation or benevolence on the Prophet's part towards you. And like that does seem to me like a really prevalent logic, so that it goes beyond just experiences of the Prophet to sort of building something more durable and bilateral, if that makes sense. And, you know, like whether the word connection is the right word, I'm not sure. But I would want some word that sort of, you know, sort of gives this sense of like you're actually building something between the two of you.
Yes, thank you. Maybe it's just one word. I mean, this sense of gratitude also, I feel, maybe, which is for the Mawlid. It's an event of gratitude, of celebrating gratitude, maybe also, which is one element, maybe.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that the gratitude too, I think that's integral. It's a pervasive theme. You find it throughout the poetry. It's, you know, it gets into like fatwas and discussions of like, well, why do a Mawlid? You know, like, well, it's about gratitude, right? But like, it's not sort of like, well, God bestowed the Prophet on humanity and human beings should be very grateful and then you thank and you're done. It is about sort of this ongoing kind of dialectic of benevolent, you know, sort of benevolence and thanking being this sort of like virtuous cycle that you are perpetuating and escalating by rejoicing in the Prophet.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question from Ustada Mitsafi. He says, thank you, Ustada Katz. As always, I recall a place that Shimel talks about having experienced a Mevlut or a Mawlid ceremony in Turkey in the 50s or 60s, and how it was prominent in women's circles. You mentioned so insightfully about connection with life circles and rituals, and I was wondering if there is any more information about women's participation in Mawlid ceremonies beyond that. Were the men's and women's Mawlids held separately at this time, at the time period?
That is a great question, and it may be that others, sort of will come up with more evidence than I have thus far. I mean, clearly women were already holding Mawlids in this period, right? And, it's hard to tell. So Ibn Talq sometimes, he sometimes tells you that he's going to Mawlids that are held by named women, right? But like, and it gives you the impression that Mawlids weren't always single gender, right? But then sometimes you get the impression that, like say in association with a wedding, say that there might have been separate single gender Mawlids. So like, I just find it very hard to determine, right? Like something like a man saying that he's going to a Mawlid held by a woman. But I mean, like on the other hand, I don't want to say my impression would be women were doing Mawlids, women were probably performing Mawlids. It seems as if Mawlids weren't always single sex. But I also want to emphasize that so much is unstated, like I keep on going back to Ibn Talq because he's writing a diary. It's sort of an unusually sort of direct nuts and bolts. I did this. It was in so-and-so's house. This is a person who is who was holding the Mawlid, right? But like, he's not interested in telling us the things that we so often want to know about things like gender. So, I mean, it is perfectly possible that in a given instance, a woman sponsored a Mawlid that was by and for men, right? And like, I think it is, we know enough about women holding Mawlids that can't have always been the case, but like, it's really hard on a nuts and bolts level to sort of really, sort of get any kind of sense of like, how prevalent was it? Like if a woman held it, would it be a woman reciter? How often would it be single sex? I so far find that super hard to determine.
We also have a question from Ustada Barbara von Schlegel. She asks, are you willing to speculate on the intervening centuries and then the present day with regard to Mawlids in the Arab world? I had a project on the modern Sufi women in Damascus and their personal relationships with the Prophet, Fulbright approved. President Al-Assad did not issue US visas that year. I feel I don't get the
what would Jesus do, I think.
Oh, what Jesus do, right. And the triangulation of Jesus husband-wife relationship of evangelical Christian couples has an imprint on young Syrians in the last couple of decades. Any thoughts? And so she says, real love, real direct involvement in individuals' lives by the Prophet, So the intense emotions and Mawlids I have been part of are an indication of this personal bond in community.
Well, that's a fascinating question that I really can't answer. The only Mawlid I've ever been to, okay, I think I've been to like 2 in Syria. This was really a long time ago when I was researching the book, and one of them that I went to that was in a private home, it was actually a Mawlid that was in honor of a young woman deciding to start to wear hijab, which was really interesting. That's sort of an occasion for Mawlids that, seemed really unusual to me. It just, having only dipped, sort of gotten the slightest taste of modern, and by modern, I'm like around the year 2000, right? This was a long time ago. Having gotten the slightest taste in, I also went to one in a mosque, but I just like, I felt as if that was like a really different landscape of Mawlids, and I think it would be, I'm really sorry you didn't get to do that because it would have been fascinating. but like, I really felt that like, wow, this incorporates some of the elements I'm familiar with, but this is a very different world of Mawlids than I was familiar with, which contrasts with like being in Yemen. There was a lot of continuity with the things I was seeing, you know, like in the historical record, you know, acknowledging obviously all the many things that must be different. But, you know, just on a concrete level, I was seeing a lot of the same components.
I'll perhaps dig into my archives and kind of pictures and send you a couple of pictures from a Mawlid in Cairo in 2017 during the Rabi al-Awwal, that there were both men and women and participating in there. So I'll make sure to send you pictures, and I have a few recordings there. And it is right besides the Maqam of Al-Hussein in Cairo. So I'll remember to do that and send them to you. So we have a question from Yasmin Amin. Thank you so much, Professor Katz. You mentioned that the religious scholar was not necessarily specified to be male. As you know, there were female Quran reciters in Egypt starting from the Mamluk period onward until they were silenced after 1940 with a fatwa that women's voices are awra. Some of them became singers. Many opted to sing praise and Madih songs for the Prophet. Many of the Mamluk Quran reciters had a previous career as Madih singers or professional mourners. So apart from the exclusive women's Mawlids, were there female reciters or Madih singers and female religious scholars in the normal Mawlids or just in the women's Mawlids? Or in other words, could you share some more about women in this Mawlids?
Yeah, I mean, all of these are fabulous questions. I mean, I know that there were munshidat, right? But like, I do not, and you know, like it may partially be, I have never done, you know, sort of systematic research on sort of trying to figure out the gender dynamics or combing through sources for female reciters. It may be that somewhere someone has done some of that research, but I haven't. I think that it, you know, like, you know, so Ibn Tulun definitely, you know, like he has a biographical entry. He is a tarjama for a female singer, right? You know, like we know those people were around, but sort of trying to get into the nuts and bolts of, you know, mixed groups versus single sex groups, and, you know, who did Mawlids as opposed to other contexts where somebody could do Madih. You know, I wish I knew, but, you know, like I really cannot give you a good sense of that.
Really quick, one of the things that comes to mind when you were talking about this fact that Mawlids have kind of been under-theorized, I was concerned, so I used to ask questions about this idea of the modality of the presence of the Prophet during the Mawlid. And so I was usually asking to be directed to particular texts, so an explanation that was offered quite common was the metaphor of the light. So the same way that the light of the sun kind of can be in the same place in different times, that serves as a way to understand the prophetic presence, possibly in different Mawlids happening at the same time in different parts of the world. But you know, I would agree that kind of was almost frustrating that in a way it was under-theorized, and also I'm looking forward. I haven't been able to kind of put my hands on it, but there is a new book on a group of munshidin that I actually met in Cairo. And so I think it's written by a journalist. I don't know what's in there, but I think it's fascinating to have accounts of munshidin and this is a fascinating group of young men. I spent a little bit of time in Cairo. It's called Al Hadra, and so I'll be very curious to kind of finally get the book and see what comes out of it. Yeah. But if I could read really quick one more question from Ustada Barbara. To Omidi's question, pre-modern Mawlids in a home, women would be in the audience but screened. but men would not be present at women's Mawlids. If there are no immediate questions right now, can I perhaps throw, yes, please go ahead.
Just in terms of what you were saying about the Prophet's presence, I think, I think maybe I should sort of like retract or critique my own use of the term under-theorized, because like, I think it's sort of, that's not what they're doing. And, like it can feel like a deficiency when one is, say, trying to write a book about Mawlids, right? But like the fact, I mean, one argument one can make is either that that's not really what's important for participants, or that, sort of doctrinal points like that, sort of typically only get elicited when conflict arises, but also that possibly the degree to which some of these doctrinal issues are sort of muted or marginalized may actually be helpful in sort of bringing people together around practices that may be, I mean, obviously there are practices like the standing that become flashpoints for like doctrinal dispute, but I feel as if some of this may be sort of, if anything, facilitated by the fact that it's less overtly doctrinal. I remember that, again, this is a modern example because we sort of can't ask participants in pre-modern Mawlids what they think they're doing. But I remember asking a, munshida in Yemen, like an elderly woman, someone who is like at least a generation older than myself, so can the Prophet hear you? Like, is the Prophet there? Is the Prophet hearing what you're saying when you recite a Mawlid? And she was like, absolutely. No doubt about it, the Prophet hears me when I recite a Mawlid. And I asked a well-educated young man, someone like 10 years younger than me, about that. And his reaction was like, he seemed a little worried about my mental health. He was sort of like, well, he sort of wanted to talk me down from this idea. So, like I just, maybe I shouldn't have used the term under-theorized in the sense that, like from the point of view of the functioning of this set of devotional practices, it may be a feature rather than a bug, that it doesn't, sort of strongly commit itself to a bunch of overt doctrinal positions. I don't know.
If I may go for a moment to this kind of our concern with connectivity, because you touched upon this tension that is ongoing, so to speak, about the prophet, about the parents of the prophet. When you mentioned Amina, and it's interesting because the mother of the prophet, she becomes kind of a vessel of miracles. All the miracles that are transmitted in terms of the birth of the prophet and witnessing of the light, and the light that is pervasive in the room where the birth takes place. These are all experienced and kind of recounted from the vantage point of the mother of the prophet. And it becomes a point of contention to kind of accept their salvation despite the question of the historicity as to when is Shahada taken. So it's kind of because she is the mother of the prophet.
Yeah, I mean, Burhanuddin Naji has a whole spat with Jalaluddin Suyuti on whether the prophet was
So yeah, I'm sorry, I cut you off. So basically, if you could perhaps speak a little bit about this, because I think that it speaks also about the idea of the descendants of the prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, that in a way what they carry in them, both in terms of fadl and in kind of salvific property, is due to this connectivity with the prophet. But it kind of it goes back even to this connection with I mean, it informs also Muslim ideas about the parents of the prophet. Yeah,
I mean, I don't know, again, like sort of we get into the area of a lot of different people with a lot of different, sort of theologies and ideological positions have done Mawlids or written Mawlids in some form or another. But I mean, I guess my own sort of really macro takeaway of what I think of is like Ibn Makkiyah to me seems like just a classic Mawlid that's sort of for a good chunk of several hundred, at least a couple hundred years, that's sort of like, it's not like there was ever a Mawlid, but it's like, okay, his components just feel really mainstream, right? And I would say that like, even though I don't think that I don't think that the Mawlid sort of is implicitly, let alone explicitly, sort of like making doctrinal statements that are sort of strong. And I think once people start making them explicit and critiquing them, it makes the Mawlid vulnerable. But like to me, the connectivity of the Mawlid is a very sort of populist connectivity, in the sense that, like part of it is that, it can be a sort of, even though you can spend a bunch of money on, say, food or a really good reciter or something like that, it's, compared to, say, traveling to Medina, it's a relatively low expenditure kind of thing to do. And I feel as if sort of the kinds of connection to the Prophet that are sort of centered and evoked in sort of, again, the average Mawlid text where there's an overwhelmingly disproportionate, in terms of space and number of lines, you're really with Amina a lot, you're with Halima a whole lot, right? Compared to like the heavy hitters, the really important figures of, you might not even meet, Abu Bakr or Ali ibn Abi Talib, or really, really, really important figures in the Prophet's life, right? And I feel as if, in a very sort of non-explicit, non-doctrinal way, it's sort of holding up this model where you can feel this intimacy with the Prophet. And, it's really not making a statement or problematizing, like, were these people Muslim in the theological sense and what's their legal status and stuff. It's just modeling these emotions that you can feel too, right? Or this experience of sort of cultivating a sense of intimacy, right? Which, like sort of, if you put it in doctrinal terms, can become really problematic. But I feel as if, in just sort of when it stays on a level of sort of evoking emotions and sort of like modeling pious feelings, that it feels really effective, right? Of sort of like, yeah, like Amina longs for the, like she feels anguish at separation from the infant Prophet, and you can feel that anguish, right? You can feel that longing, right? I don't know, like, yeah, I mean, I feel as if it's there, and I feel as if it's different. It's meaningfully different from other kinds of connectivity, like say, descent from the Prophet's family, right? But because it's operating on this sort of like it's not non-discursive because it's in words, but I mean, like it's non-conceptualized, right? It's getting you to feel these feelings rather than, like advancing some kind of proposition of what the religious status or significance of a figure like Amina or Halima might be, right? And how it relates to other claims of connection to the Prophet, right?
And perhaps a source of, it might be of interest for someone, perhaps you, if you have interest, to look into even the texts of Mawlids that were written about Khadija and other, at least in the Hijaz, it was always in Ramadan that the Mawlid for Khadija would take place. So that's perhaps
amazing.
Yeah.
Do you know, how much do you know about sort of the longer history of the Mawlid of Khadija? I mean, are there manuscripts going back or?
I never looked into that aspect. I have attended quite a few Mawlids of Khadija, and my sense is, in a way, it was more of a Meccan thing, although it would happen in Jeddah and in Medina as well. But it kind of carried a particular weight in Mecca, and you can see it even in other forms of material culture. For example, the old tomb, the old dome of Khadija's tomb before the Saudi destruction in the Mawlid cemetery. You'd see that very often in Meccan homes. So kind of Khadija
like had a depiction of that.
A depiction, yes, yes.
Of the dome, yeah.
Or kind of rendering of old pictures of the dome over the and because the Mawlid cemetery itself is kind of a lot more relaxed than the Baqiya, it doesn't carry the same sectarian tensions with then the visitations of the maqam of Khadija. It says, at least in my experience, has always been more relaxed. And since you have written on Sayyid Muhammad Alawi al-Maliki, he's been buried literally kind of, it's very close to the burial of Khadija. And I think we have a comment from Ustad Hamid. Given the destruction of the tombs of Khadija, Fatima, and other women, it would be fascinating to see if there are mawlids associated with these women similar to the Süleyman Çelebi Mevlud tradition in Turkish. And unfortunately, I don't know like who's the author, but I've definitely been to quite a few mawlids of Khadija in the Hijaz. But I mean, you can comment on what Ustad Hamid just wrote.
Yeah, I mean, I know that these, I know that these things exist. I have not done work to try to reconstruct their history, and I think it's just someone should do that, but I have not. So all these people have these great questions that are great research ideas, but unfortunately, I have not done this. So
is the expectation that you are the the Mawlid person, the person to go to on the Mawlid. So are there any questions before we you can go ahead and then I'll
okay. Maybe one thing about the Mawlid, because as you know, and as you mentioned of course the critique of the Mawlid, especially contemporary Islam, the debates, etc. So, doesn't this debate also reflect two visions of, how to say it? Maybe two visions of history and of salvation history, of yes, of course, of religiosity as well, in the sense that the Mawlid, I mean, celebrating the Mawlid makes only sense if you say that the event of the Mawlid is not something purely historical.
Yeah.
But it does have a meaning even for Muslims today.
Yeah.
And saying that there is no sense in celebrating the Mawlid presupposes somehow, I mean, this is my question, whether you would agree, presupposes to believe that this event has a purely historical significance. I mean, it happened in the 7th century, and that's it. I mean, there's no meaning beyond this. So there are two visions related to the celebration of Mawlid, I think. Would you agree on this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are sort of a couple of things going on, because I definitely agree that there's something going on with temporality, right? And I think that particularly when it comes to discussions of, sort of justifying the observation of the Mawlid as a calendrical festival, as, like something that happens cyclically on the day or in the month of the Prophet's birth, that there tends to be an emphasis on the sort of non-homogeneity of time, the idea that there is something different about the day or the month of the Prophet's birthday, and that actions performed at that time, like it's particularly propitious, and there is this sort of, amplification or magnification of the religious rewards and blessings of, engaging in pious activities at those times, right? And so like, yeah, I do think that there's sort of a distinctive sort of vision, temporality associated with Mawlid piety. On the other hand, I think it's a little different, it does to a certain extent become sort of like disengaged from this idea of sort of like cyclical festivals, right? I mean, it always remains a cyclical festival, but to the extent that it becomes this sort of like, form of piety that, that is multi-purpose and, then, over the centuries gets repurposed for everything from like weddings and births to coming back from the Turkish military or starting to wear hijab in modern Syria or whatever. I think then it becomes a little bit detached from these ideas about temporality and sort of like the non-homogeneity of time and the availability of sort of, I mean, the way I thought about it in the book was, when people are sort of trying to think it through in terms of the calendar, they really do have recourse to ideas of sort of like, that there are some times that are different from other times, and time becomes sort of a dimension that's sort of likened to space, right? Like, well, we all know that like making a pilgrimage to the prophets, to the prophet's tomb, like the tomb is special in space and the Mawlid is special in time, and sort of like the Mawlid is sort of making the time of the prophet's birth available in a way that it couldn't possibly be available if you just thought of time as purely linear. I think that it's not that people necessarily start thinking of time as totally linear, because they certainly don't, but like those themes start to become less prominent when it's sort of like you can do it anytime for a whole range of reasons. And then, I feel that this whole idea of like time, then it really becomes like the devotional poetry that is incorporated into it, right? That it's still about accessing all of this barakah and all of this thawab, right? But like, like the idea of sort of accessing the birth as an event, like I feel as if that then starts to come down to like, well, what's happening at the Qiyam, right? And things like that. And because that is so, sort of usually not explicit, I find it hard to sort of then get a handle on how people are really thinking of time, or how people are thinking of sort of the availability of the event to them, right? Because you have these actions and people are either intentionally or unintentionally leaving their theological significance, largely unarticulated. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think it's going on, but it's not always that present, at least when people aren't doing it as a calendrical kind of thing.
I think we have been very bad hosts and abused your generosity for so long. We'd like to thank you, and first of all, very happy to see you after so long, even if virtually. Looking forward to meeting you soon, and thank you so much for this very rich presentation. It has been a pleasure to listen to this lecture. I would also like to thank everyone who participated and who joined us. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day or good night wherever you are, in whatever part of the world you happen to be right now. I'm very grateful that you accepted our invitation, Professor Katz.
Thank you so much. It was really my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Please join us whenever you have time. We have 3 more sessions. Sarah Islam next week is going to present her recent dissertation on blasphemy against the Prophet. She defended her dissertation a couple of months ago from Princeton University, and so we're very thrilled to have her present next week. Whoever can, please join us. Thank you very much, and have a good night.